Now, settle in. Get comfortable. The story I'm about to tell comes from the Blue Ridge Mountains, those ancient folds of Appalachia, where fog doesn't lift so much as it settles, becoming part of the air itself, becoming part of you if you stay long enough. People who've never lived in deep mountain country don't understand what silence really means. In cities, silence is just absence, emptiness. But in the mountains, in the hollows, silence is alive. It's a presence. It has weight. These mountains are old, worn down by time into shapes that almost look soft. But don't mistake that for gentle. They're patient. They're listening. These mountains hold on to things. They hold on to sounds. A voice called into a holler decades ago might still echo through the rock faces, through the root systems beneath the earth. Sound doesn't disappear there. It accumulates. It pools. It waits. What I'm about to share is Case File 073. It comes from the deep archives. It involves a man named Silas Brant, a retired search and rescue veteran who spent 43 years finding people in those mountains. He knew them better than his own face. Every ridge, every ravine, every twisted path. He was the mountain's servant in a way. A voice calling in the dark, a light in the wilderness. 3 years ago, Silas's wife Martha passed away. 3 weeks ago, Silas started hearing something at 3 a.m. He heard Martha's voice calling from Kettle Hollow, the deep gorge behind his cabin. The thing that called itself Martha wasn't Martha at all. And what happened next is why we're here. It's why you need to listen to this story. Because the thing in that hollow is still calling. And it's learned new voices since Silas disappeared. It might know yours. It's 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. Silas stands at the edge of Kettle Hollow. His flashlight cuts through darkness, disappearing into the gorge below. He's been here hundreds of times, but never at this hour. Never when the mountain speaks. His breath comes in small clouds. October. The temperature has dropped like something thrown down into darkness. His flashlight hand trembles. Not from cold, from recognition. Because it's happening now. The voice. And Silas is hearing his own name called back to him. Not Martha's voice anymore. Not the ghost of his wife, gone 3 years into the ground. His own voice. His own inflections. The way he pronounced certain words. The slight rasp from quitting smoking in '98. it calls. Silas, come down here. And the terrible thing, the thing that will haunt you when you're trying to sleep, is that he almost does. He almost takes that step, because the voice is so perfectly his own, because some wounded part of him, the part that lost his wife to cancer, wants desperately to answer. The flashlight beam shakes. The low, the hollow sounds like breathing. And Silas understands in that moment that he's made a terrible mistake. Not tonight, weeks ago. The mistake happened the first time he ignored what he was hearing. The first time he let the thing know he could hear it. Now it's learning his voice, practicing it, getting closer. Let me take you back, 3 weeks prior. Let me show you Silas's life as it was. The cabin sits on a south-facing slope, 1 mile from the nearest paved road. Built in 1967 by a man named Claytor Hughes, who raised tobacco until his hands wouldn't hold a tool anymore. Silas bought it in 1994. Board and batten siding painted deep burgundy. Metal roof, it sounds like rain in storms. 2 chimneys of stone, mortared by Hughes's own hands. The cabin sits at the head of Kettle Hollow. The hollow runs 3 miles down and eastward, eventually emptying into Crabtree Creek. Slopes steep, nearly 60 degrees in places. The floor is filled with hemlocks and cedar, moss-covered rocks the size of cars, water that runs year-round. Even in drought years, water runs in Kettle Hollow. Some places don't dry out. Silas didn't used to fear Kettle Hollow. He'd been down it 100 times, searching. In 1987, he found a hiker missing for 4 days. Broken leg near a formation locals called the Devil's Throne. He'd rappelled down, splinted the leg, brought the man up. He knew the hollow. It knew him. But something had changed. It started on a Monday night. Silas was sitting in his armchair reading a mystery novel, bourbon beside him. The television was off. The house was quiet, the way it always was since Martha died. He'd learned to fill the silence with books and small routines and prescribed sleep aids. And then, at 3 a.m. exactly, the grandfather clock in the hallway had just finished chiming. He heard it. A voice. It came through the walls. Not loud, not alarming, just present, as if the house itself had exhaled it. It sounded like breathing shaped into words. Among those half-formed syllables, He could almost make out a voice he knew, a voice that had said his name 10,000 times over the course of a marriage. Silas. His name, drawn out across several seconds, the way Martha used to call him when he'd been outside too long and she wanted him to come in for supper. He didn't get up. He didn't go to the window. He simply sat there, bourbon growing warm in his hand, and listened to the wind move through Kettle Hollow, carrying with it the ghost of his wife's voice. In the morning, he tried to convince himself he'd imagined it. He was wrong. By the end of the first week, it was happening every night. Always at 3 a.m., always starting with his name. Always that same tone, sad, patient, almost gentle, as if Martha was waiting for him to remember something, as if his grief had an answer, and she was holding it just beyond the hollows and ridge lines. Silas tried to ignore it. He tried sleeping with earplugs, foam ones you roll between your fingers and wedge into the ear canal. That didn't work. The voice seemed to phase around them, traveling through his skull instead of his ears. He could feel it in his teeth, in the fillings, in the bone itself. By the end of the second week, he'd bought expensive noise-canceling headphones, medical grade, the kind used in sensory deprivation therapy. He set up a speaker beside the bed and played white noise, rain on metal roofs, rushing water, wind through leaves. All night, midnight until dawn. 8 hours of static between him and the hollow. For 3 nights it worked. He actually slept through until 6 a.m. He woke refreshed for the first time in weeks. He thought he'd won. He thought technology could save him from the mountain. But on the 4th night, something changed. Silas woke at 3 a.m., and the white noise had stopped. The headphones were dead. And in that silence, that terrible, absolute silence, he heard something else entirely. It was coming from inside the cabin structure, from the walls, from the copper pipes running through the house. The voice was vibrating through the plumbing. The metal was resonating, turning the entire house into an instrument. A tuning fork struck, and humming at a frequency that made his spine ache. The whole cabin was singing with Martha's voice. And underneath Martha's voice, underneath that familiar tone, Silas could hear something else. Something deeper, a frequency that made his bones ache, a sound like metal groaning in extreme cold, like insects screaming at the edge of human hearing, like the earth itself breathing. He tore the headphones off and sat in the darkness, trembling. His heart was racing. His mouth tasted like copper. the same metal singing through the pipes. The voice was louder now, not aggressive, not angry, but insistent. It wasn't calling his name anymore. It was speaking in sentences, saying things Martha had said, small things, intimate things, pet names, jokes they'd shared, the way she used to ask him during that final year when cancer made her afraid if he would be okay without her. "I'm here," the voice said, "perfectly, Martha, but also not, because it was coming from the very bones of the house, from the copper and the wood and the stone. I'm here, Silas. I came back. I never really left." He didn't sleep that night. He sat in his armchair until dawn, drinking cold coffee, watching the darkness gradually lift from the windows. The voice faded as the sun crested the eastern ridges, but he could still feel it vibrating in the pipes, still humming, still waiting. But he'd already understood by then that something fundamental had changed. The thing in Kettle Hollow had noticed that he'd noticed it, and it was getting closer. It was learning. It was listening to him now, the way he'd been listening to it. Desperation does strange things to people. On the 15th day, Silas drove into town. 20 minutes down the mountain through switchbacks he'd driven 1,000 times, and went to the SAR station. The building had been updated, new computers, modern radio system, but the files were still there. Old cases, old reports, stored in filing cabinets in a climate-controlled basement room. He had a friend there, a woman named Donna Chen, who'd worked with him for 15 years. She didn't ask many questions. She simply pulled out the boxes marked 1975 through 1982 and left him alone. Silas's hand shook as he went through the files. At first, nothing. Routine rescues. A hiker lost. A child wandered off. Standard incidents. But then, buried in a 1977 file, he found something labeled Acoustic Anomalies, Kettle Hollow, Incident Report. The report was written by a ranger named Cole Pittman. It described disturbances reported by residents near the hollow. Strange voices calling in the night. The voices sounding like missing persons who'd supposedly been found days or weeks earlier. One case involved a young woman named Rebecca Ellis, missing for 5 days. When found, dehydrated but alive, sheltering in a cave, she claimed she'd heard her own voice calling from deeper in the hollow. She described it as familiar but wrong, like listening to a recording of yourself, except the recording was changing. The The implications made Silas's chest tight. How many people had heard these voices over decades? How many had walked down into that hollow, drawn by sound of their own grief? Cole Pittman's conclusion was short. No scientific explanation found. Recommend environmental evaluation of hollow for geological formations that might cause acoustic distortion. Nothing had come of it. The anomalies had stopped. Life had moved on. Perhaps no one had been listening with the right kind of attention. No one desperate enough. No one alone enough. But Silas understood now. They had stopped because there had been no one to listen properly. No one isolated and grieving enough to hear what the mountain wanted to say. He replaced the files carefully and drove home in the fading light. At 3 a.m. the voice would start again. And this time, he would know exactly what it was. Which brings us back to that moment at the edge of Kettle Hollow. At 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, with Silas standing on the precipice, hearing his own voice call up from the darkness. "Come down here, Silas. Come where it's warm." And that's when Silas understands the final horror. It isn't about getting him to the hollow. It was never about drawing him down into those ancient rocks. The thing has already moved inside. It's in the walls. It's in the copper pipes. It's in the floorboards and the insulation. It doesn't need him to come to the hollow. The hollow is already inside his house, inside his chest, inside the place where his grief lives like a second tenant. When Silas goes back inside that cabin, and he does go back inside because there's nowhere else to go, he finds Martha sitting in his armchair, or something wearing her voice like skin, and it smiles at him with a mouth that opens too wide, and it says, "We can't go back, Silas, but we don't have to go forward either. We can just stay here, in this moment, in this hollow, where the mountains hold on to everything forever." And Silas closes his eyes. The next morning, a neighbor found his house empty. No signs of struggle, just an open door and Silas's shoes placed neatly side by side on the front porch. They searched Kettle Hollow for 3 weeks. They never found him. But if you live in those mountains, if you've ever come near those ridges in the deep hours of the morning, you might hear something strange, a voice calling from the rocks, and if you listen closely, you might recognize it as your own. If you aren't asleep yet, the archives are deep, so very deep, and there are more files waiting, more cases, More voices calling from the hollows of places that time has forgotten. Join the all-night horror playlist. Link on the end screen. Let the darkness carry you down, the way the mountain carries sound. Let it settle in your bones and your teeth and the copper pipes of your own small house. And remember, as you drift toward sleep, if you hear your name called from the trees, if you hear a voice that sounds exactly like your own, don't answer. Sleep well.